This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
The Religions of Man with Dr. Huston Smith.
You have been listening to the call of a muezzin, a man who calls the faithful to prayer. 5 times a day throughout the Muslim world, this man mounts to the minaret of his mosque and, in a clear and penetrating voice, just as you have heard it, calls the faithful to prayer. God is most great. Come to prayer. There is no God but Allah. This is one of the most powerful calls in all the world. We tend to think of it as being heard in Arabia. Actually, however, the Muslim world extends far beyond that, over into Africa and actually a good deal further west than here depicted, up into Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and then on up northeast into the outlying provinces of China and far deep into Southeast Asia, Borneo, Sumatra, Indonesia. Throughout this entire area, this call is heard. It virtually blankets this entire territory 5 times a day, calling actually 1 out of every 7 men and women in the world today. Now, what does it call them to? Well, to prayer, of course, but deeper than that, it calls them to an entire way of life, an outlook on the world, on man, and on God, which shapes the life of the Muslim down to its minutest detail. Last week, we considered some of the basic ideas in this outlook. We noticed how it focused in the idea of Allah, the God, all-powerful yet merciful, farther than the farthest yet nearer to man than the vein of his neck. We noted how theoretically for every Muslim, his life should be a constant outpouring of gratitude towards God translated into action and love for his fellow man. We noted how every Muslim regards his actions as under constant surveillance and judgment by God, so that he will be called and held accountable for his every deed on the day of judgment following this life. Those were some of the great underlying ideas of Islam which we attended to last time. Now this time, we want to move in on this religion to see what are the basic practices which it involves. And this is going to be comparatively simple. Simple because in comparison with other religions, Islam is remarkably explicit about what practices it expects of its adherents. Let me put the matter this way. Suppose I wanted to find out what a stranger's religion was, and I hired a private detective to shadow him. Well, how many religions are there which reveal themselves explicitly enough in the lives of their adherents so that without seeing them go into their particular church or read their particular Bible, you would know what religion they belong to. Well, I don't think there are many religions that are this specifically translated into action and practices. But Islam is certainly one of these. Specifically, there are 5 great practices in Islam which, as long as you live up to them, entitle you to regard yourself as a Muslim in good standing. Each one of these practices is summarized in a word. And here they are. Let me read them to you. Creed, prayer, charity, Ramadan, and pilgrimage. Together they constitute the famous 5 great pillars of Islam. And as I say, as long as a Muslim is faithfully living up to these 5 prescriptions, he can satisfy his conscience, he will be at peace with himself, with his God, and with his fellow man. Now, let's look at these 5 great pillars of Islam in more detail. First, we have the creed. Most religions have, if not a formally stated creed, at least some articles of belief which give a kind of orientation to the life of the adherent. Islam is no exception here. Its creed is brief, it is simple, and it is very much to the point. It can be stated in one sentence. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. At least once during the life of every Muslim, he must say this creed. Actually, of course, he will in practice say it many times during the day, each day usually, but at least once in a lifetime he must say this creed slowly, correctly, thoughtfully, aloud, with full understanding and with deep conviction as to its truth. This is the creed of Islam. The second great pillar is that of prayer. Now, when should a man pray? Even this is stated in Islam. It isn't left up to the individual whim of the believer. 5 times a day, upon arising, at noon, in mid-afternoon, at sunset, and before retiring. Now, why should a man pray? When we come into that question, it gets a little more difficult. I've often asked myself that question because people pray for various reasons. Some pray essentially to ask for things, prayers of petition. Others pray primarily for meditation and contemplation. Why does the Muslim pray? If we had to put it in a phrase, I think we might put it this way. He prays in order to bring his life into proper perspective. It has often been said that the most difficult lesson a man has to learn is that he is not God. Creature rather than creator, man seems to have an incurable tendency to place himself at the center of the universe. And yet, when he does so, things begin to go wrong. This is reflected in our everyday language, as when we say, who does he think he is? God? No, man is creature, and his life takes on right perspective when he recognizes this fact. So, when we ask why the Muslim prays, he prays to establish this proper perspective, to place himself in his rightful relationship, to acknowledge his creatureliness before the one God, and to submit himself to the will of God and acknowledge it as sovereign over his life. Now, what does his prayer consist of? And I think we can say 4 things. things. First, it consists of prayer and thanksgiving, which rightfully goes from man to God. The Muslims say that a bird, every time it drinks a drop of water, lifts its eyes in gratitude towards heaven. Ideally, man too, every microsecond of his life, they will say, should be a life of praise and thanksgiving to his Creator. Well, actually, we slip away from this, but 5 times a day, at least, we should come back to praise and thanksgiving to God. Another element of prayer is to examine. One examines one's behavior. How has it been since the last time he prayed? And if there has been any wrongdoing, he then moves on to forgiveness and to ask for forgiveness and to resolve to do better. And then in the end, the prayer includes some petition for some problem which the life is facing. When we ask how the Muslim prays, he prays always facing Mecca, and his prayer is a combination of vocal utterances plus gestures, which begin with the hands parted to the side of the face and then move towards a folded position, and then the supplicant will bow and touch his hands to his knees and rise again to his full height, and then sink slowly to the earth and bring his head to the ground in acknowledgement of his submission to God and his desire to follow the will of God. Prayer, then, is the second great pillar of Islam. Now, the third great pillar is charity. Material things are important in life, as we all know. They're very important. We also know that some people have more of these than others. Why? Well, Islam doesn't center on the philosophical question of why this is so. Rather, it turns itself to the practical question of what we should do about this situation. And their answer is that it is incumbent upon every man to help lift the burden of those who are less fortunate materially than he is. It may be some handicap, physical handicap, which prevents the person from working as others who are able-bodied can work. But whatever the reason, it is the duty of those who have to help lift the condition of those who have not. Now, again, one of the fascinating things is that Islam doesn't leave this in general terms. It goes on to state specifically how much you should do by way of help. And the figure that it arrives at is 2.5%. Well, this looks relatively bearable. We are used to a tithe, or 10% for charity in our own Western tradition. But actually, there is another aspect of this. The 2.5% is not simply of income, it is of all holdings. So at the end of every year, you total up your assets, and 2.5% of what you have must go to the poor. Now, who does it go to? Well, specifically, first, towards any relatives that you have who are in need. Second, to any neighbors. You see, the personal element comes in, and let me say in passing that all these gifts should be ideally, so to speak, in the form of an anonymous check, so you don't use this to build up the obligation of the other towards you. And then after your relatives and neighbors are taken care of, the wayfarer comes next. People who are on the move are often in need. We should do what we can to help them. And then finally, if there's any left over, then through public agencies who administer this, we can turn it over to them. Well, to us in the West, who are used to social insurance and various relief agencies which operate on vast scales, this may look very crude and inefficient. But we ought to keep in mind that before Mohammed there was nothing in this area. And instituting this rule of 2.5% of all one's holdings towards those who are less fortunate was truly a revolutionary economic measure. Now, to the fourth great pillar. And this goes by a strange word to us, the word Ramadan. Actually, this is the name of a month in the Muslim calendar. It is the holy month of the Muslims, partly because it was during this month that Muhammad made his historic flight, the Hijra, from Mecca to Medina, and all Muslim history dates from that point, 622. Another reason is that it was in this month that the opening portions of the Quran were first given to Muhammad. Now, what does one do in observing this holy month? And the answer is that it centers on fasting. Fasting for an entire month during the daylight hours. From the time that dawn breaks, that's even before the sun rises, from the time the dawn breaks to the time the sun sets, no water, no food must pass your lips. And Ramadan, I might add in passing, is a lunar month, so it rotates around the year. When this month falls in the winter, why, it's not so bad. But when it falls during the summer, under the blistering sun and the desert sands, to go for this stretch of time with nothing passing the lips is quite a trick. Again, it's well that we ask ourselves, why? Why do they observe this? Well, fasting makes you think, as any of you who have done it will realize. It also underlines the dependence of man upon God. Man, as they say in the Quran, man is frail, frail as a rose petal. But we have airs and pretensions. Fasting underlines our dependence upon God. And a final, very good reason, they say, is that it augments our compassion. Because only those who have been hungry can understand what hunger means. So after you have been hungry for these days every year, when you're approached by someone in need, you'll listen a little more carefully to his needs. Finally, the last of the great pillars is the pilgrimage. This isn't mandatory, but everyone who is physically able and economically able ideally should make one journey to Mecca, where the religion originated. This, they say, will increase one's devotion to the religion. But beyond this, there are also some supporting reasons. Indirectly, this pilgrimage will do two things. Again, it will emphasize the equality of man and man. Because when you go on this pilgrimage there, you strip off all your clothes, and clothes are such a neat indication of social status. You strip those off and you don instead two sheets, sheet-like garments. But the point is, everybody wears the same thing. So these distinctions of rank and hierarchy are removed, and you see yourself next to your fellow man with these barriers lifted away, and you sense the basic equality of all human life. Another indirect value of this pilgrimage, they say, is that it is internationally helpful in international relations, because it brings together people from various countries, and it shows them that they have a loyalty which transcends the loyalties of the state, which divide men. And incidentally, you pick up some information about your brothers in other countries, and you understand them better when you go back home. These, then, are the 5 great pillars of Islam. You will have noticed that they deal almost entirely with the personal life of the individual. But Islam cannot be restricted to that area. Perhaps, again, more than any other religion, it proposes to state specifically the regulations which should govern interpersonal relations. And so the Muslims will claim that here within the Quran is to be found a complete constitution for human life. Now, what does it say on the social problem? Let me just bring our discussion this evening to a close with that question. And I want to touch on three of the great areas of interpersonal relation. First, the economic. What does Islam say on this? The first great innovation it made in this area was inheritance laws. The great underlying principle of Muslim economics is to avoid vast concentrations of wealth and to keep the money circulating. One of the things they wanted to do then was to break up the large estates, the large holdings. And so Muhammad prescribed that there must be no primogeniture. The inheritance must be divided among all the children, and this works for distribution. A second principle of their economics, well, actually it's stated in one verse that there should be no interest charged on loans. That has been reinterpreted now to mean that the interest should not be charged if the loan is to a person in need. But if it's for a business purpose, that is set aside, and as long as the purpose is worthy and the interest rate is not too high, this is allowed. But to people in need, no interest must be charged. And finally, in economics, there is the principle that unearned money is not your own. Theoretically, every time you lift a morsel of food to your mouth, you must ask yourself, have I contributed to the human enterprise sufficiently to deserve what I am eating now? A second great area in human relations is that of sex, the relations of men and women. We've already noted that Muhammad, in this revolutionary act, prescribed that women as well, daughters as well as sons, must share in the inheritance. That was a great step up also in the first place. But beyond this, he went on to say other things in this area. One is that wives must be limited to 4. Islam is often caricatured as advocating 4 wives and introducing polygamy. That, of course, is not true. It does not forbid polygamy, but what it does say is to introduce the ceiling of 4, and moreover, it adds this very important thing. It says that all wives must be treated equally, and any man who cannot live up to this not too simple injunction must confine himself to 1. The last area that we will touch on is the area of force. You see, these two. Oh, I want to say one other thing about while we're talking about sex, because it really comes in here, I guess, as well as any. One great stress in Islam is on the absolute equality of races. And they go to the ultimate on this and say that complete equality will not come until intermarriage, actually, is accepted. That's the final test of complete equality. And so they say that Abraham married a colored woman, Hagar. They say that Muhammad married a Negro. Actually, Muhammad's color was probably that of Jesus, white with a very deep tan. But he married a Negro, and he had one of his daughters, gave one of his daughters in marriage to a Negro. All this to underline the absolute equality of the races. Well, now finally in the area of force, this, along with the matter of the wives, is of course where Islam has come in for great caricature in the West. One of my friends used to say, he was a Muslim missionary, he used to say that his, from Pakistan, that the average American conception of a Muslim that he had encountered was a man who marched with a sword in front of him, trailed by a whole string of wives. Well, these are the 2 areas of greatest misunderstanding, I think. In the area of force, this is what I think we have to say. First of all, Islam does not advocate that we turn the other cheek. There is no doctrine of returning good for evil, but rather evil must be resisted with force. Moreover, there is, too, a concept of the jihad, the holy war, and anyone who loses his life in a holy war will surely go to heaven. But a holy war must involve two things. First, it must be a just war or a defensive war. Now, when it comes to practice, whether these have been lived up to, then we're in the intricacies of history, far beyond any ability of ours in these brief moments to summarize. I think all we can say in closing on force is that there is a growing recognition on the part of Western historians that history has not been written fairly. When it's been written in English, has not been fair to the Muslim point of view on this, though there may still be points which seem to be far short of what the Quran actually legitimately advocates in this area. Well, this in briefest compass is the core of the practical content of Islam. With some of the religions in this series, we have had to admit that perhaps we were looking at a dying religion, a religion which was on its way out, sinking under the forward surge of history. Not so Islam. Youngest of the great religions of the world, this religion has about it the strength and the vigor of youth. It's not merely consolidating its position today, it is expanding. It's growing and growing very rapidly. Some think that it's the fastest growing religion in the world today. We open this evening with the muezzin's call to prayer. And I would like to close with this also. Some of you may never hear this call again in your life. On the other hand, if you should, I hope it will bring back to you some images. The straight path, the 5 pillars of Islam, the simple camel driver, Muhammad, who responded to a call and transformed his world. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is most great. God is most great. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I testify that there is no God but Allah. La ilaha illallah. I testify that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. La ilaha illallah. Arise to pray. Arise to pray. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. God is great. There is no God but Allah.
Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, St. Louis Educational Television Station and Production Center.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.